G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. I often get asked by people, what's the one factor that thriving farming operations all have in common? The fact is, there isn't just one. There's a whole host of factors that combine to create both a thriving family and a thriving agribusiness. But what always intrigued me was whether there was a common factor in a family business that allowed them to thrive both now and keep thriving across the generations. In my experience, one of those factors is effective leadership. Leadership of the family, leadership in and of the agribusiness, leadership of the advisors and consultants, and finally, leadership in the community. Effective leadership is often hard to identify or quantify, and it's fair to say that most of us are not born leaders. We have to both learn and grow as a leader if we want to be successful. So if you see the value in becoming a better leader yourself, or you want to lead your family, or you want to maintain your family agribusiness for another generation, then this will be the podcast for you. That brings me to our guest today, leadership expert Brendan Rogers. Brendan's the host of the Culture of Leadership podcast and a leadership business coach. With 25 plus years in leadership roles across business and sport, Brendan has a passion and is all about creating confident leaders. So without further delay, welcome Brendan.
Ben, thanks for having me, mate. It's a pleasure.
Fantastic. Now, for everyone listening, can you just give us a bit of a quick summary of the journey you've taken to get to where you are right now, which is running the Culture of Leadership podcast and also as a leadership coach?
Absolutely, mate. What I want to preface, I guess, some of this background with is that it actually wasn't that long ago, only probably a few years back, that I was thinking back around my journey of life and reflecting on some stuff. And fundamentally, I've been a coach for a long time. I didn't really realize it and wasn't putting it that lens, but I've coached football, young kids in football since I was a young teenager, effectively. So I'm now 48. Coaching's been in my blood right the way through. That started with sport. I was lucky enough to play some semi-professional football, love my sport. And then I took some of those learnings and I led semi-professional teams, took some of those learnings across into the corporate space, spent about 20 plus, 24, 25 years in the corporate space. I worked for some of the sexiest businesses going around, which is global shipping, containerized shipping, break bulk shipping. I've never met anybody actually that leaves school and says, I just can't wait to get into shipping, which is why I call it such a sexy business. No one wants to do it. But as the pandemic proved, it runs a lot of things and moves a lot of cargo around the world that people just don't take the time to realize. So anyway, in that journey, I got the opportunity to lead large teams, learn to facilitate large groups, learn to run big projects like global system implementation type projects, run lots of smaller type business improvement type projects. I led large customer service teams. I worked internationally, got great opportunities to work overseas in the UK, and I've spent lots of time in various Asian countries working, not necessarily for long periods of time, but visits and a month here and a month there. India, one of the most fantastic countries on this earth, I believe. And just through those experiences, what I had through that journey was fundamentally, I believe, two things. There was a really solid work ethic in that journey, and with that work ethic just came a hunger to learn. So I always wanted to learn stuff, and I worked hard at learning stuff and learning from other people, and not just the good stuff. Again, we learn a lot of things to do by learning what people made mistakes in. And that would really underpin the whole journey that I took. So that really drove everything I did. That gave me great opportunities to embrace that learning, embrace the journey, work with lots of different cultures, lots of different teams, and to take me to where I am today, which I've had my consultancy business since 2015. Part of that journey, I did work for a client full-time for a couple of years, which again was another great opportunity. And part of the journey that put me to where I am today, which is have great fun with a podcast, as you said, The Culture of Leadership. That's also a consultancy and leadership development business coaching business. I look after a number of clients and it's good fun. Ultimately, I have fun doing it.
Perfect. Now, the interesting part is I interviewed someone recently, Tess Cam, and one of the things she said out of there, which I absolutely concurred with, is that most of our clients are farmers or agribusiness producers. And so what happens is I want to start to interview or do interview people from outside the agricultural industry, because I can tell you right now, you can quite often learn a lot more from someone outside the industry that you're in than sometimes listening to people that are in your industry, because it can be a bit of an echo chamber. You just get the same information. And so that's why I'm really excited about talking to you today, because your experience is so varied and so wide just in that leadership space, which in many instances is something that agricultural producers struggle with, dealing with people, how to lead a team, and quite often that team can be a bunch of family members. And so leadership is becoming more and more important in the space if you want to be successful. So how would you define leadership, and how important is it to the success of a business?
Defining leadership for me, this is my own definition that has taken me all of that journey I spoke about, time to solidify and understand. And to me, leadership is simply about taking deliberate action to develop your character, to build your competence, to create connections so that you can elevate yourself and you can elevate others. Now, we can unpack that a little bit more if you wish, but
yes,
ultimately
please.
It is if you can work on yourself, and where I say this has taken me a long time to get to that level of clarity, if I think about developing character, for me, we should always be developing our character. What can we do to become a better version of myself? Now, whether that's through some feedback process, self-awareness, there's lots of personality type tools. There's even just the mind shift. And I call it a mind shift rather than a mindset. I learned that from one of my own guests on the cultural leadership, that it's really this mind shift to make sure that as a priority, you're putting other people's needs ahead of yourself. So there's a few things that underpin this, what makes up character, even our ability to listen and the mindset needed in order to be interested to listening to other people's and learning their stories. That's about character for me. When we get into the competence side of things, that building competence, that's leadership competence first and foremost. So things like, how do I run good one-on-one type meetings? And there are various types of one-on-one meetings, whether that's a performance type conversation, whether that's a learning growth type conversation. How do I run better team meetings as well? That requires a different skill set as opposed to a one-on-one meeting, because as a team, we expect leaders to be able to facilitate naturally, facilitate conversation and mind for conflict and dig into areas to try and help solve problems together and the best out of our team. That is a skill set that you have to develop over time. So there's alignment of team. How do we get alignment in our team? And there's some basic questions, some strategic type thinking that we can apply in that competence type space. I also put, probably because of my background, but I just think in business, whether you're an agribusiness, whether you're a pharmaceuticals business or any business, the ability to strive for excellence is super important. And my background in business improvement, continuous improvement. So I touch on that and go deep with my clients around, well, how do we start to set up, what does Process X look like today? What do we want it to look like tomorrow? Is it scalable today? Is it a sustainable process if you've got 100 people going through it versus 1,000 people going through it? So there's some of the nitty-gritty stuff. As a leader, you don't necessarily need to understand the nitty-gritty of that, but you need to be able to think, well, I know that we can do something better. I know that I can be better at this. How can I build my competence around these things? And sometimes that means that people work with someone like me, or they get onto YouTube, or they listen to a great podcast like this to learn bits and pieces from people's experiences. Then the last piece of the puzzle, which to me is fundamental, is that creating connection. And if you think about people, and the system that I've developed is my people operating system, because leadership is about focusing on people. It's the relationships we create. And if you're working on your character and building your competence, then people will start to trust you more, and that builds a greater connection. You're able to coach them. You're able to help them develop and elevate themselves. And this is where I go on to the last bit of the definition. Elevating myself, that's a really key point, couple of mentors said to me many years ago now is that leadership's not about you, but it is about you. And this is where, for me, you need to be focused on elevating yourself. Another mentor of mine, and these two guys are partners, he said, Brendan, you never want to be the limit on your team's performance. So again, if you're not always focused on improving yourself by developing your character, building your competence and creating connection, then you will reach a limit and your team will try to go past you, but you're in a powerful position as a leader. So you're reaching that limit all the time if you're not improving yourself and sort of staying that step ahead of your team, so to speak, from a development perspective. And ultimately, again, as I said before, one of the pinnacles of leadership is the ability to elevate others and put other people's interests first. So that's how I've come to, over 25 to 30 years, come to some sort of solidification of what the hell does a leadership mean? Because there's so many great definitions out there, but this is what it means to me. This is what it means to my clients. And that's how I apply that through the work that I do with my clients.
That's really good. So I wrote down, just correct me if I've got this right, character, competence, and connection.
You nailed it, buddy.
Okay, fantastic. So it creates trust, and then you're able to effectively lead a team. And look, one of the things that I took on there was, if I look at an agribusiness, there's a certain number of agribusinesses that are running teams of people. So they might have one or multiple employees, but in a lot of case, it's not 50 or 100 employees. So it's not an area that someone gets to practice very often on how to manage and lead teams. And so I think where the big risk is when it comes to your family. So doing family meetings, because obviously most rural businesses are family productions, being able to facilitate the meeting. I think you said something about unearth conflict and deal with conflict. And what was the other thing around meetings?
So team meetings versus one-on-one meetings is just an example of some of the competence needed.
Yeah. So can you just go back and expand on that team side? Because I think that's a really important side, because if families are trying to facilitate family succession or family business meetings, these are some of the key areas they probably need to learn about. So can you just unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And good pickup. There's a number of ways to run team meetings. And again, there's various types of team meetings. It might be I follow a lot of work around a guy called Patrick Lencioni. I really like his meeting structures. I've adapted some of those to my own thinking and the type of businesses I work in. But we can talk about something like a daily check-in, which is a bit of an administrative type conversation. First up in the morning, like, what are your top 3 focuses today? Just so we can get some alignment about where this team is focused on today and what we're planning to achieve. Then there's things like the weekly operational or tactical type meeting, and that's working on, what do we need to focus on in the next 7 days? And there's some structures that go above that. And then there's strategic type meetings. So that's probably where a good example might be where you're working with a number of your clients off the back of your podcast, those strategic conversations around financials. It's looking at the longer term view. What's this impact over the next, might be 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30, whatever that is, but there's a longer term view of that. So there's a basic sort of structure of meetings as an oversight. With a team, a weekly type, operational type team meeting, one of the things that I think is really important, and again, there's a number of ways to break this down. I'm not sure we're going to have the time to do all of the types here. A great question is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? So if we're bringing people together around a table, and let's say family, and I know you referred to sort of the family businesses and stuff like that. I've not worked with your type of business, agribusiness, but I sort of liken it to, family business. It's almost like the senior leadership team of an organisation.
It's exactly the same, mate.
Yeah. Hopefully there's clarity around the types of roles that everyone on the team does. I think there's probably some challenges with family. There's maybe some assumptions made about what people should be doing, and that's maybe where some breakdown happens. But if you've got people around a table, you've got to value that time. You don't want to waste meeting time, which is why I like to unpack what is the problem we're trying to solve, first of all. If we get people aligned to the problem we're trying to solve, it's like determining the scope of the conversation, isn't it? Okay, let's bring us all onto the same page, and now we're all focused on whatever this problem is that we're trying to solve. And as the leader, the senior leader in that conversation, then their job is to help unpack the views of the people around the table. So Ben, what do you think we should do about solving this problem? What does that look like for you? And then Jack, what do you think? Jill, what do you think? Where are we at with this? Okay, what actions do we think we should take in the next period of time, either in the next 7 days, and there may be a combination of some other things. Okay, over the next month or two, we've got to put X, Y, and Z into place. But as a facilitator, as a leader, this comes back to that facilitation of large groups, whether that's a group of 3 or 4 around a table, whether that's a team of 8, 9, 10 people. The leader's ability to be able to get insight from everybody around that table. It doesn't mean to say that every decision needs to be a democracy, but it does mean to say that if you can get people to buy into the conversation, then they're probably going to weigh into the decision moving forward. And that's super important. So if your listeners can take away something like that from a meeting perspective, get clear on why you're bringing people together, i.e. what's the problem you're trying to solve, and focus on the person who's leading the meeting, extracting as much of that wisdom, information, experience, gold out of the people around the table, and then starting to drive forward to get, okay, what are we going to do? Get some action and decision making. Then they'll have pretty good meetings. I can guarantee they'll have better meetings than what they probably have used to having, which is people sitting around a table not really sure on why they're there, first of all, so they don't know how they should be thinking. They're not sure on what the problem they're trying to solve. They're not sure how they can contribute. And if people don't know these things, what do? They don't contribute. They sit there and think, what's going on here? Not sure. And then what happens? The meeting that should have been had in the room happens outside of the room, which is the worst meeting to have.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. And if I think about most family businesses, is there is no structure around meetings. And this is what we can learn off the corporate world or the larger scale world is, you should be having regular meetings. I love those 3 meetings was the daily get together. So for the day, then there's the tactical meeting, which is what's going to happen in the next 7 days. And there's strategic meetings, which is the next 1, 3 or 25 years. They're 3 different sorts of meetings. And then going into a meeting, it sounds to me like you absolutely have to have someone leading that meeting. And so that's what happens when you go into these family meetings. They need to have someone that says, right, I'm going to lead this and chair or facilitate this meeting. And then we need to work out, well, why the hell are we bloody even here first? Like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And it might be multiple problems, but at least if we come in with one problem to start with, we're going to go away with solutions. And I also noticed in there, you said something along the lines of aligning everyone on the same page, which is by gathering information or input from everyone. So if you've got all the family in the room is gathering their input and then being able to make a decision going forward. And it may not be a democracy. Someone may have to take the reins and, make that decision. But at the end of the day, you then need to come out with actionable items at the end. Otherwise, it just becomes a talk fest. And the last point I got there from you was that, which was a really important point, is have the meeting in the meeting. Don't have it outside the meeting.
100%, super important. And this is where, again, the dynamics in the team are super important. So again, I'll refer back to Patrick Lencioni. He's not the only sort of leadership guru that I like to sort of frame some of my thinking around, but he also wrote a great book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And if you just understand at a basic level that every team has an element of dysfunction, okay, but it's identifying what the dysfunction might be. And it might be a lack of trust, which is at the bottom of the triangle. So, okay, how can we help with a lack of trust? Well, that's really about better understanding of each other, learning a bit more about each other, just connecting on a human-to-human level, because a lot of the time that's where the problem sits. It's not that, I'm just here to frustrate the hell out of you, Ben, because I get enjoyment about it. If that's the case, then they're probably not the right person to be operating on a team. They maybe should be just, in an individual contributor type sales role and just focus. But understanding that every team has some element of dysfunction, whether it's trust, whether it's the conflict, whether it's the commitment, whether it's the accountability, whether it's inattention to results, understanding that, knowing how we can work with that, have a conversation around that, and then we can move forward. And that, again, working through that from a family environment perspective, you'd like to think that there's already that cohesiveness in relationship and people have spent a lot of time with each other and therefore know each other fairly well. But there's still stuff in families that we just don't talk about that we should do. If our son or daughter, or if our partner upsets us in a certain way, or they're doing certain things, and if we don't talk about some of those things, and believe me, I know this stuff and I don't do it enough sometimes in the family unit, that you've got to get it out and have a conversation around it. And then those things just create more trust. They open up, they strengthen the bonds between people, because they feel like, well, I know that if Ben's feeling a certain way, I know that he's going to come to me because there's past experience that he has done, and he knows that I'm going to have a conversation with him when I'm feeling a bit unsteady about something. That's the sort of basic conversation and the power of conversation that gathers so much fantastic momentum in teams and in leadership positions. And as I said before, as a leader, leading any type of meeting, or somebody owning that meeting, if their single purpose is to focus on how do I ask good questions and get good information out of people, and also understand the room, the nuance of the situation. If I'm sort of sitting there and I'm noticing that you're moving around in your chair and looking a bit sideways and just looking a bit uncomfortable, it might be like, Ben, you look a bit uncomfortable about what we're talking about. What are your thoughts? Like, there's nothing wrong with calling that sort of stuff out in a conversation. There's respectful ways to do it. Might be like, Ben, what the hell are you, what's wrong with you, buddy? Or again, different ways of doing it. But calling that stuff out and putting it out on the table, again, strengthens the bond within the team and strengthens the opportunity to overcome things like dysfunction in teams.
And families have probably got more dysfunctions than anyone, because there's literally a lot of family history. They don't communicate as well on average, and it makes it far more complicated when you've got family members involved. So here's the thing, the way I look at it is, farmers or agribusiness producers have got far more leadership, I think, than the average business owner. And I look at it this way. I think there's 4 areas. There's the operational side. So that's, in the business, leading the employees, contractors, etc. Number 2 is the family. You've got to lead your family to success, especially if you want to become successful across the generations. And that's a key point I see in a lot of successful multi-generational families, is they've got strong leaders at the helm, male or female. Number 3 is your consultants or advisors, your agronomists, your accountants, your bankers, your financial advisors, your lawyers. You've got to lead that team to get the results you want. And finally, the community. Remote and regional people are usually heavily involved in the community, so they need to have a leadership role in that sort of thing. So it's a complex area. So I actually think this is probably one of the key indicators, or one of the key areas, if you're in an agribusiness, if you want to either get to the top and lead that family, or you already are there, is to improve your leadership. Now, my question to you is, Brendan, you work with businesses and you walk into that business. Where do you first start when you're striving to improve leadership in the business? Like, you go in, you get your pens and pencils out, and you go, right, we've got to get stuck into this. What are you actually looking for, and what do you do specifically?
The shortest answer is it really depends, mate, doesn't it? There's so many, how long's a piece of string? There's so many things that could be going on in an environment, whether it's an agribusiness or some other organisational small business context. When I'm starting to work with a client, or even before we've done anything sort of formal commercial arrangement with working together, I'm having various conversations with them. And my focus as a person who's trying to help a person in a business, or a business as a whole, grow, develop, whatever they're looking to do, is identify what the pain point is. Like, why have they come to me? Why have they found me in order to, what's the problem that they're trying to have solved or have supported to be solved? So, as I said before, it really depends. If I'm listening to them, asking questions, listening, asking questions, listening, I'm going to get to a point where, okay, now I'm understanding the problem you're trying to solve. Am I the right person to solve that? Well, again, I've got some pretty good business experience through what I shared earlier in the show. So there's a lot of facets to what I'm able to do. I generally come into that leadership development space and growing the business, but there's always this process stuff that sits behind that. So I find out what's their pain point, why are they really seeking me out, and what's this pain point they want solved, and what are they willing to hand over, some pretty good of their hard-earned dollars in order to help this problem be solved. In my early days as a consultant, if I wasn't talking to the most senior leader, i.e. the business owner, then that was a problem for me. That's less of a problem now, because eventually, if they really want to solve the problem or the problems that they think they have in the business, you've got to be talking with the senior leader ultimately. And in a family situation, there should always be, there's not always, but there should always be a person who is still the CEO, the MD, the senior leader of the organization, and the buck stops with them. So that's where I want to get to as best as I can, because why? Culture is a reflection of leadership. What is happening in the business below that is a reflection of what that senior leader is doing or isn't doing, depending on what we're uncovering. Through that process, we then start to work. Again, I do a lot of my work week to week, session-wise with business owners. And then on a quarterly basis, depending on the size of their team and where we're at with the team, I will do quarterly offsites with them. And that takes on to the next point of, well, where do we want to go with this business? What does the trajectory look like? Is it just the business owner is trying to get some time back because they started a solid business? They're this rugged individualist like you refer to, which is a great reference in my view as well. And that took them so far in the business, but they need to get some time back. They want to grow the business, and that growth could be me getting more time back and allowing the business to function more without me having to be tied to it completely. So again, we start to get a perspective on the problem we're trying to solve, where we want to take the business moving forward. We work with the organization. And again, if that's a leadership team of 2, 3, 4, whatever that is, we start to gather some alignment through that. Now, again, there's a few fancy things we might do in a strategic type conversation, a strategic type offsite, where that's 1 or 2 days. But ultimately, we're looking to get alignment. We're looking to get everyone on the page committed to where are we going into the future? Where do we want to take this business? Now, I have to say, COVID changed me a bit as far as how far do we look ahead. Sometimes I think, like, I can see from your space financially, it's really important to look further ahead, absolutely. But I think in business, operations, growing the business, whatever that looks like, I think there's a risk with that now, because it can make us not as nimble as what we may need to do. And I think COVID really proved that, the pandemic proved that. So I tend to go no more than 3 years nowadays with business and say, where do we want to be in 3 years? What does our gross profit look like? What does our net profit look like? What does our operational team look like? What do our services type look like? What are our pillars for this strategic direction that we want to take the business? What do we want to be exceptional at? And unpacking some of that. I don't have the answers to that. My job's not to have the answers to that. My job is to understand business enough, irrespective of whatever the business is, have the ability and that mind shift I spoke about earlier to want to learn more, to ask questions of them, to try and move them forward into getting some clarity and alignment about what this ultimate goal looks like in the next few years, and then start to extract that gold information, that experience that everyone around that table would have through their experience in the organization and outside the organization, to bring that together in a nice, cohesive little wrapped package with a bow on it about, okay, this is what our strategy looks like. Effectively, strategy, in my book, is simply a plan to take us from A to B. How long A to B is, well, that's up to you as a business. How far do you want to look ahead? If it's 12 months, okay, great. This is where we want to be in 12 months across a number of areas. What do we need to do in the next 90 days? What are the most important things we need to focus on? And then ultimately, again, we unpack that a bit, but we want to get owners against those areas and those things to do. And then we have some accountability structures in place to make it happen. Now, again, I've never worked for an agribusiness, but business to me is business. If you can do that in some shape or form in your business, and I know you do that with your clients and obviously do it very, very well because you're booked out, then that's all you need to do. And it's like a rinse and repeat process. Do that enough times and move with the markets when you need to, with whatever's happening, whether that's sort of drought related, weather related, whatever that is in the businesses you work with. But if you're nimble enough to move with that and just adjust the strategy as you need to, then you'll always be moving forward. And to me, that's a good thing. Sometimes people get frustrated because they're not moving forward as fast as they'd like. But ultimately, if they're putting some of these really solid foundations in and they're working as a team and they're aligned as a team into what that end goal is, then at some stage that momentum will just build and build and build, and it becomes hard to stop.
It's interesting, mate. I wouldn't consider myself a good leader. I know when I had my financial advice business, I had a team that worked under me and I used to really struggle. So I wasn't born a good leader. But one thing I've noticed, one is very few people are born good leaders. So they need to learn, which you mentioned before. But I think the one thing that I see a lot of families make the mistake of is they have problems. Like, you know how you said, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And the problem is external of them. It's always external of them. I've got problems with employees. I've got problems with, whatever it might be, family, operationally, with the banks, etc. It's always them. And I noticed when we first started talking, you talked about, building character. And I think one of the key traits I quite often see in successful leaders is the fact that they're very humble and they believe the problem starts with themselves. The fish rots from the head down. It's the same in business. And so can you talk to a little bit about, that character? Because I want to get back to that. I think that's a really important point, because I think if you've got problems and you focus on improving yourself and becoming a better listener, a better communicator, a better leader, more empathetic, more learned, more wise, all those sorts of things, a lot of your problems are going to start to disappear. So can you just unpack that character? I know we're going a bit backwards, but can you unpack that, what you'd see as the key components of character when it comes to leadership?
Mate, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going back because it is such an important point. Character, and again, a great pickup from you. If we talk with the level of humility, you mentioned humility, I think, that humility underpins so much in that character space. Why? Because character, for me, and as I referred to, about developing character refers to about developing self. In order to develop self, you have to be open and vulnerable enough to know that I can be better. And that mind shift I spoke about, that's important, because if your mind is set on, well, I don't need to be better, I'm going okay as it is, as opposed to having that mind shift, and people can shift their mind, which is why I like to refer to it that, then we've got a level of humility. Our mind shift is about, hey, I can be better, and if I can help myself be better, even if I don't know how I need to be better, that's where coaches and good support people come in, business coaches, whatever they need, but they know, they're open enough to know to seek the right support, to seek the right help, to ask what some may deem as silly questions like, oh, you don't know that? Well, no, I don't. That's why I'm asking. But hey, I need to learn more about this. What can I do here? What can I do there? You talked about leaders being born or referred to trained to it. So for me, I don't believe leaders are born. I believe that everybody can be a leader. What I also believe is that not everybody should be a leader. Why? Just what I referred to just before and earlier in the conversation. Back to that character piece, back to that humility. Humility is really ultimately being open about our weaknesses, but also understanding our strengths and how we can contribute really well to the business. Making sure that I'm solid on that, because I'm not, what people forget is that you just look at humility as being open and, hey, I'm showing my weaknesses and I'm no good at that. But if you're also not confident, not braggy, but not confident about, hey, I know I'm really good at this and this is how I can best help the business, then you're also not that much of a asset to the team, because the team's going to say, hey, I think you do, I don't think I'm that great at that. I think I'm okay. And
too much self-deprecation.
Absolutely. So, and the ability or the want to be a better person, the want to have development in your character is the underpinning of what you need to do to learn to be a better leader. We talk about some of these soft skills like listening and awareness and getting feedback, and there might be self-awareness, there might be team awareness. So what's happening? I referred to team awareness without saying it in a team meeting. Like, are you noticing different movements in people, whether that's a bit of body language or just they're looking uneasy? If you're feeling like they are, then just ask, hey, Ben, are you feeling uneasy? That's a level of team awareness, and that's situational awareness in the situation, in the moment, because they're all elements of awareness, but they all sit in the character piece. And if you know yourself well, if you understand how you can be triggered by certain events, situations, environments that you're in, and you can respond to those as opposed to reacting to those, then you're doing things in a much more controlled way through responding. And I say to leaders, to business owners, to people in teams, if we do something like a personality style approach, and again, I do that with all of my clients because there's good science behind that. I need to understand a little bit more what the science is saying, and it creates a level of standard about conversation as well. But if you're talking about those sort of things, and let's say I'm a certain style. So as far as DISC goes, which is pretty globally recognized tool, I'm what they call a CS, conscientious and supportive steady type person. Now, it's not about withholding those strong urges, those strong feelings I have, and what we would call strengths about that style, or the weaknesses for that matter. But even our strengths in a pressure type situation can become our weaknesses. We can double down on our strengths so much that they become a weakness. For example, I'm a person that likes to have information. Your preparation for this conversation and sending me information, it's not that I don't know my stuff. I mean, people may listen to this and say he's talking rubbish, but I think I'm fairly competent in the work that I do. Then, but I still like to have some idea of the framework, the mindset, what you'd like to get across to your listeners. So that helps me and my conscientious type style. But if I'm put under pressure, that could be a time pressure, that could be a financial pressure, then I may want more and more information, and actually more information than what I need in order to make a sound decision. And that's where a strength can double down and become a weakness. So all of these things that I refer to and talk about, that comes up in my bundle of what character means to me. And fundamentally, to close the loop on all of that stuff that I've talked about, is educate. You have to educate yourself, whether that's books, whether that's fantastic podcasts like this, whether that's YouTube type stuff, whether that's mentors, whether that's coaches, whatever works for you, or a combination of all the above. You have to always be focused on educating yourself. And if you can't find the answer, you have a level of self-reliance, which again in leadership is super, super important for me. It's no victims out here. It's like, how can I be self-reliant to get the information I need, to find the person who has the information I need, to seek out people that can help me learn, grow, develop, all those sorts of great things which underpin leadership. If you've got those things in a nutshell, then you've got an unbelievably solid and developing character, which in my view supports really good foundations for great decision-making, great thinking about the team first and yourself second, and for driving good outcomes with the right intent and the ability and the knowledge and the want and the need and the love to elevate yourself and the others that you're working and supporting through your journey.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice, mate. I remember someone said to me years ago, Brendan, they said something along the lines of this. It was, the difference between confidence and arrogance is competence. And I thought that was a really interesting one. So in other words, you can be confident but not arrogant about things. And I think that's really important as part of the journey is, some people think, well, these confident people are arrogant, or I have to be arrogant to become confident. And I think if you can work on being competent, naturally that confidence will come through and people will see it. The other thing, mate, is I just want to make a point, because we're getting close towards the end now, but the other thing I want to make a point of is, I quite often see young people where they don't have great leadership in either the family or the business. And so they come to me and they'll say like, oh, mum or dad, and they're not letting me take over. They're not giving me any responsibility. I try and have conversations with dad and he just shuts me down. Or, there's a long family history here. I'm trying to deal with my brother or my sister. And my advice always to them is, they always say, Ben, what can I do? Like, how can I fix this? And my first point is, well, work on yourself. Mum, dad, your situation is quite often outside of your control. Work on what you can control and start educating yourself on how to communicate better. Dad might be a bad communicator with you in the farm. Well, you should become the master communicator so you can actually get around that. Mum and dad aren't giving me enough opportunity to lead or to run this business or take on some responsibility. Will become the person that it becomes for them a no-brainer that they want you to do that. Like, work on yourself first and then worry about other people. And I think if all leaders in all fields did that, we'd be in a much better position.
Mate, you're spot on. To me, that's really sound advice. The other thing I would add to that is, as they're developing themselves, developing their character, and listening and the ability to ask questions, understand, all underpins the communication. What you're referring to is ask the question. Hey, Dad, I feel like you don't want to talk to me about this. I'm feeling like you wanted to shut down conversation. Help me understand. Why is that? I just don't want to talk about it. Okay, but what's driving that not wanting to talk about? I need to understand. I want to be able to support this process. I want the best for the business. I know you want the best for the business. It might be hard to talk about, but we've got to talk about this because it's about leadership is also about building legacy. The worst thing that can happen, I think I haven't researched it enough to know all the intimate details, but I've read enough articles. And Alan Joyce, again, everyone knows sort of Alan Joyce, love him or hate him. I look at him through the leadership lens and say, well, he seems to have served Qantas quite well over his journey. But for me, the greatest test is, how have you left the organisation? And from what I have read, from what I have understood through that reading, and if you take some of the survey stuff around confidence with aeroplane or plane organisations, aviation, then Qantas is just above Jetstar. So they're low budget sort of in confidence, and was something like 100 points behind Virgin now. So the damage that has been caused, I guess, even just in his last 6 months of tenure at Qantas is unbelievable and has damaged the Qantas brand unbelievably, which means that the new CEO is really starting from a low bar. And I guess some would say you can only go up, but you should never be handing over something like this in that sort of state. And that's where these sort of conversations with elderly statesmen, let's say, of business, they've run it, they've been around for a long time. These things are not always easy to talk to, and they love their business so much. And I get that. But in developing your character, it's the ability to have those tough conversations. And if you can't quite crack the nut through that first conversation, go back, reflect. There's an element of character. What can I do different next time? How can I be a little bit better? And then how can I ask the question? How can I start to crack that nut a little bit more? And through that process, you will get there. Might take a couple of conversations, might take a couple of months, might take a couple of years. I don't know. But if you're deliberate enough, and you go through that journey, and like you said, master your communication, improve that communication, and identify angles to start to get in because you've got the right intent, then you'll get there. There's no doubt about it. Just don't give up.
And continually adjust course, as you said, learn from that lesson.
Absolutely. I know we are time-wise, but there's a point you made before that second point as well in regards to competence, confidence.
It was confidence versus arrogance. The difference between the two is competence.
Thank you for clarifying. So the point that I just wanted to make about that, and I'll keep this as short as I can, is that when I see and hear people talking intellectually smart, that is a massive red flag for me, because that's where that sort of arrogance starts to come in. And in my personal experience, 100% of the time, I cannot think of a situation where this hasn't been the case, that projecting of intellectual smarts is 100% a block, a barrier for actually their lack of competence in a certain area. If you can, the power in leadership, grazing, whatever you do in an organization, if you can simplify it down to something which again, I believe that definition of leadership, and for me, if you're working on developing character, building competence, creating connection, to me, that's simple to understand. There's a bit to unpack in it, but if you can get it down to a point where it's so simple, then to me, that's showing a level of competence, a level of depth of understanding of what you're doing. You're not trying to trick people with all of these fancy words and this smart talk and lingo and all that sort of stuff. That's just sort of blowing smoke, really. And I'm sure your listeners, country folk are very, very smart people. They can smell a rat a mile away. And in my experience, it is a rat.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, mate. And I mean, I quite often see that within the professional advisor industry. So when you'll find professional advisors will come out and deal with the family, whether accountants, lawyers, financial advisors, whatever it might be, is things become overly complicated. And they do that to seem quite, in some cases, some people, I have to be very careful saying this, but in some cases is exactly what you said. It's moral superiority and trying to make them look smarter, which isn't good for anyone. So, mate, that's been absolutely fantastic. I've got 2 pages of notes here. I could have a conversation for 2 days about this. So I know my listeners will be sitting there saying, well, that's bloody fantastic. I'm probably driving a tractor, or I'm in a car, or I'm on the back of a horse. If you said there's 1 or 2 resources or things that people could do right now to go and start this journey, you mentioned a book by Patrick Lexioni. I think it was. I wrote Lexioni, and I'll put this in the show notes. That's obviously a book, Facilitate Teams. Is there anything else other than the Culture of Leadership podcast? Because we'll give that a big plug. Is there anything else you'd recommend people read or watch to get started on the journey?
There's 2 things I would recommend. And again, I can give you the link to this and you can put it in the show notes. But I did put together a workbook about 10 tips for confident leadership. So I'll send you the link to that. That's got, again, 10 tips. It's less of an ebook, more an activity book with some activity sheets attached to it. And there's also a 10 or 12 email sequence over the course of 10 to 12 weeks to unpack. That will give you, I've chosen those 10 based on my own experience and what I wish I knew more about when I first started leading corporate teams.
What a cracker, mate. That's fantastic.
That is a great resource. I am a bit biased, I suppose, but it feels like a good resource. And I've put a lot of time and effort into that, into sharing knowledge that I think can really give people a solid foundation. The second thing I would say is that as far as getting people aligned, if you're the family head of the business, the CEO, managing director, whatever you want,
patriarch or matriarch or CEO.
Exactly. If you're that person, then you need to be having one-on-one meetings with the people in your leadership team. If that's the other members of your family, if that's members of your family with people in the operations team, whatever that looks like. But if you can have weekly or no less than fortnightly one-on-one meetings, and they don't have to be long. Again, I'm talking the performance type conversation. What have we done in the last week? What are we focused on in the next week? How can I support you to be successful over this next week in getting what you need to get done, or what barriers do I need to remove so that you can be successful in whatever we're agreeing to do? Then the amount of knowledge that you get through that conversation, the amount of insight around where that person is at about their role, where they're struggling, where they're not struggling, what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying, that sort of stuff, building the connection, learning their stories, that is powerful stuff. You build that connection, which is that create connection side of the framework for me. If you can do one-on-one meetings and again, use some of the knowledge in the workbook that we've put together and is available for download and the email resource attached to it, then you'll be on very solid footing, provided you act on the information. Reading is great. We're talking about educating ourselves, but if you're just reading it and you're not trying stuff and acting on it, it means nothing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's the knowing-doing gap. It's all good to know, but if you don't do, nothing's going to change, is it?
Absolutely. And I think I know the persona of your listeners. And for me, one of the things that I would imagine, I'm making a big assumption, but the assumption I would make is that your listeners are listeners that they're working, they have a really solid work ethic, they're used to taking action. So I'm sitting here confidently without knowing your listeners personally, but knowing that if they get some good information, and hopefully we've shared some good information today and they can download some stuff or they can just take on board to do one-on-one meetings, just take action on it. I'm very confident that the group of people that you appeal to, they take action every day, mate. They're actually doing stuff.
Yeah, they do, mate. That's one thing about my audience is they're doers, not talkers. So sometimes it's just not having the resources or the knowledge on how to actually do these things. And look, the one piece of advice I give families around succession planning, because you're not in the ag industry, Brendan, but it's a massive problem in the industry. And I only had this conversation yesterday with a young lady, and I said the first thing you got to do is start implementing family meetings. Without a doubt, that has to be part of the culture, because something like 60% of family successions fail because of a breakdown in trust and communication. So if you can actually have those meetings with the family, that's the greatest gift you could give your family. And the second thing that came out of here today is someone has to take leadership of those meetings. If nobody's responsible, they'll never bloody happen. And it's like, oh, well, Brendan was supposed to have organised it and I'm busy and someone else. Someone has to be the champion of that. Someone has to be the leader. So my challenge to everyone listening out here, if you are in a family succession or in a family business and you're wanting things to get better or you're wanting to become a better leader, is start to act like one. Take responsibility for these things, have these meetings, learn the skills, and start to drive the business forward. Don't be a what I call a ditherer. You've either got to be a doer or a ditherer. Ditherers talk about it and never do it. So that's my small bit of advice. Well, look, Brendan, we've run out of time now, mate. That's been absolutely bloody fantastic. This has been one of my more enjoyable podcasts to do, mate. I've really enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. I've got so much information out of that. I'll be downloading that workbook. I'll put a link to that on the website, but also on the podcast description, so anyone needs it. If someone can't get it or there's a problem, just email me, ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Brendan, mate, I love your podcast. I'm a listener of your podcast. I listen regularly to learn. I think anyone that's in a business, whether it be an ag business or anything else, should be listening and growing those skills. Where can people find you online to get on board, mate?
Mate, there's not too many places we aren't, actually. But obviously we have the website, thecultureofleadership.com. We're on YouTube as well. So we've got a pretty active YouTube channel. That's Culture of Leadership. And LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn, both personally, Brendan Rogers, and Culture of Leadership as a company page on there, Facebook, Instagram, even Twitter. We play around with some of that stuff as well. But so there's lots of areas you can go to find us. Can I just say one thing in closing, mate? I know you're trying to shut me up.
Absolutely.
What I have to correct you on is one thing, because I hate when people think they're not good leaders or they've been a terrible leader and stuff like that. I've known you for a long time. We were talking off air and trying to determine how long we've known each other. But for a long time, since I've known you, you've always been a person that has been developing your own character. You've been building and continue to build competence in everything you do. You're always striving to be better at what you do and driving excellence, and your ability to create relationships, create connections is first class. So you're doing that, you're elevating yourself, and just through the nature of what you're doing in your show and the people you're helping, clients one-on-one and the teams you work with in the agribusinesses, you're helping elevate them as well. So in my definition, mate, you're not only a top bloke, but a pretty top leader as well.
Thanks, mate. I appreciate that. I don't take compliments really well. It's one of my weaknesses. So all I'll say is thank you. Now, mate, I like to ask everyone a question as we finalise going through. Mate, you're just a couple of years older than me. If you had to go back now and you were, let's just say 30-year-old Brendan, what's the one bit of advice? You jump in your time machine, you go back, you have a beer, you have a coffee, whatever that might be. You sit young Brendan down, you go, righto, mate, we need to have a bloody chat now, young fella. What piece of advice would you give young Brendan?
It's always a classic question, isn't it? There's so many angles you can take with this, but I thought about, again, your listeners, you, and the knowledge you share out. And the thing that I wish I knew and did in my 30s, even earlier, is work not only my wealth creation, work my debt reduction muscle, but also my wealth creation muscle. And what I mean by that is that we've had a long-term strategy more around property, and we've done okay, and we continue to do okay through that. And there's debt reduction mindset always around property. What we haven't done so well is really just take that same mindset and think, well, if we're putting, let's say putting $100 a week into debt reduction, we should also be putting $100 a week into wealth creation. Now, whether that's index fund shares or whatever your investment strategy entails, then that's what I would wish I did back in my 30s. We've been doing that for several years now, really focused on the wealth creation deliberately around a certain amount of money every week that we pay ourselves, and it fires off into different areas. But mate, if I did that even 10 years ago, then I think confidently we would be whatever they deem as financially free. For us, we deem financial freedom as being able to do what we want when we want, whenever we choose, sort of stuff. So yeah, I wish I worked both sides of the equation, wealth creation, debt reduction together.
Yeah, that's great advice, mate. I think that's really smart. And sometimes the best wisdom comes from looking back and saying, well, what didn't I do quite correctly? Another interesting one, just before we end this off, mate, is I quite often get people to think about what would you give, say, 30-year-old yourself or 10 years ago. I then also quite often get people to go, well, if let's say you're 30 now, what would 40-year-old Brendan say? Or if you're 50, what's 60-year-old Brendan saying, the advice? And quite often the advice is very, very similar. You know, people go through their lives and the advice they give themselves 10 years ago would be the advice that 10 years later they still get. So we fail to implement a lot of the time and change the things that we should. So, mate, we better wind up now. This has been fantastic. Loved it. I'll make sure I get that link up on the show notes, etc., for the download. I think that'll be an invaluable resource. And I just want to say thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Thanks for the opportunity, mate. Absolute pleasure.
Now, before we head off, I just want to give a couple of points. You know, these are the ones that I wrote down, which I think are the most important. Number one, leadership requires you to work on your character, your competence, and your connection. All three of those are required. Number two, Brendan said there were 3 types of meetings you'd probably need to have in a family business. And that was, number one was the daily toolbox meeting. Number 2 was the tactical meetings, which are, you know, basically what's happening over the next week or so. You know, the question you've got to ask when you're in there is, what are your objectives over the next 7 days? And you ask your employee or team members, how can I help you achieve them? Or what roadblocks do you need me to move for you? And number 3 was strategy meetings, which are about the long-term strategic planning of the family or the business. Number 3, he gave us a really great question that you should have at the center of your thought or mind in the meetings that you're about to have. And I'd suggest you'd probably think about this well and truly before you have the meeting, and also bring it up in the meeting so everyone knows why you're there. And that question is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Number 4, don't be a limit on your team's performance. The fish rots from the head down. If you're leading a team or you want to lead your family or team, make sure you focus on improving yourself. Number 5, he's got some great resources there. Number 1 is I'd recommend checking out the Culture of Leadership podcast. And number 2, he also recommended a book by Patrick Lencioni, which is Lencioni. And it's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, a Facilitator's Guide. Check that out. Might give you some great tips for running family meetings. And number 6, that free workbook that he talked about, the 10 tips for confident leadership. I'm really grateful that Brendan was able to supply that and do it for free. I'd recommend go checking it out. The link will be in the show notes. And if you can't get hold of it or you can't find it, just email me, ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Now, that's it for today. If you've enjoyed the episode, I'd love it if you could share the wealth and wisdom with your family and friends. We're up to about 8,000 people every month to listen to the podcast. And essentially for 2 episodes a month, that's absolutely amazing. We're super excited and absolutely grateful for all of you who are sharing it around. Now that's it for today. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.